Welcome everyone today. We're going to have a very interesting conversation today about the quiet exit crisis. And so this is certainly something that has been happening in organizations for some time. But now there's certainly some really critical elements for organizations wanting to really understand why their best employees are leaving and how to get ahead of that. And so that's going to be the center of our conversation today. Let's do some quick introductions. My name is Caitlin. I'm our strategic consultant here at Diversio. I've been with the organization 4.5 years. And I am joined by Anya today, our president. Anya, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Thanks, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. I'm Anya. I'm the co-founder and president of Diversio. Really excited to be here today. At the company, I really kind of get down in the nitty-gritty with our data, with everything that our clients are experiencing, all of the really interesting statistics and information that we are privy to every day. So really excited to maybe share some of those stories and make some of this a little bit more real and practical for everyone on the call.
Thank you, Anya. All right, so in terms of our agenda today, we've designed the session to take you from the problems that you're facing in your organization in terms of retention to really a solution in 5 key areas. So first, we're going to set the context of why the retention crisis is happening, and then we're going to dive into signal versus action problem and why most organizations can spot issues but can't really solve them. So you've got a lot of information, but it's very hard to get ahead of that so that you can see the results and consistent results. And we're also going to introduce our action-driven retention framework for you. And then we're going to discuss common implementation failures that you can avoid, and end with a real case study so you can see how this looks in action, as well as any questions throughout. So we'll have a Q&A at the end, but feel free to put questions in the chat as we're discussing this. We'll be keeping our eyes on it and certainly get to those. So before we dive deeper, I want to set the stage here. The retention crisis isn't happening in a vacuum or isolation. There's a broader context we need to understand about how teams work, their career growth, and in a sense of workplace belonging for everyone on the team, and what that means for individuals. And so let's examine why retention has become such a critical business issue in this next slide here. So, what's going on here? Why is retention so challenging to get right for organizations? We do a lot of things to understand what makes our people happy, how to really engage them, all sorts of things like that, especially when we look at this through a DEI lens. So as Anya mentioned, we support organizations with collecting employee engagement data, diversity, equity, and inclusion data, belonging data. And from there, we've really, through the years and years of working with clients, have uncovered some really interesting points around how to target specific employees so that they can really build careers long-term in your organization. And so there's 3 really big reasons we're seeing here. First is the competitive edge. So performance tracking and analytics show us that winning in business today and business resilience for tomorrow comes down to retaining your top talent. As we all know, businesses are made up of people, and the ability of that business to meet market demands really relies on the talent that they have. So the second is belonging and inclusion. So diverse employees often have very different workplace experiences. And this is something that we see again and again in all organizations across the world when we do this review for them, is that specific employees have a very different experience of the organization compared to other employees. And so if we don't understand how those employees experience belonging, how can we create environments where they want to stay as well as thrive in that organization? And the third point here is economic strategy. So in times of uncertainty like today, retention becomes a CEO's people strategy. And leaders are really trying to learn how to retain top performers as well as how to predict who's going to stay so that they can look at succession planning and all of these very key elements within an organization. So there's obviously a challenge here. Retention is so important, but time and time again, organizations are coming forward and saying, "Hey, this is something that we're continuously trying to work on and get right." So, Anya, we're seeing AI reshape how organizations think about both talent acquisition and retention. I'd love you to walk us through why retention is so critical in this new age of AI, because this is something, an element that's been added, and I think everyone's top of mind for sure. Oh, I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Let me try again. I said it's a great question, Caitlin, and I think that obviously the way that AI is reshaping the workplace is very much on everyone's mind right now. Um, And one of the kind of forces that we're seeing with the advent of AI is organizations are really consolidating their workplaces, and the people who are poised to sort of take on the jobs of tomorrow will be very well versed and sort of cover a lot more ground than potentially employees in the past. And the reason why this is happening is because, of course, our productivity and efficiency with which we can do things is so much greater. We can now handle a lot more by way of oversight or, as part of our portfolio. And what that does mean for companies is that a loss of one individual is actually going to be felt much more acutely than previously. If we have extremely high performing, high potential talent with oversight over, for example, an entire department, losing that individual will hurt the company much more and will be much more difficult to replace than, for example, maybe 5 or 10 years ago when someone's purview was a little bit smaller. And so now this idea of, the workforce of the future, retention becomes very, very critical because if we only have, a department of a handful of people as opposed to much more with oversight over many different aspects of the work, we want to try and retain those folks long term in the organization for that knowledge and those abilities. So that's sort of the way that a lot of the organizations that we're working with are thinking about this now.
Yeah, certainly. And I imagine a part of that is also really clear skills mapping. So you know what employees have certain skills in your organization. So that you can say, okay, like certain employees have X amount of skills. Let's be able to kind of shift them from area to area as we start to consolidate these very specialized roles.
Exactly.
Wonderful. Okay, so what's the real challenge here? Let's talk about that. So why do so many organizations still struggle with this? And we've been working on this for years and years and years. The real challenge here is when top performers leave. Companies face not only the direct costs of recruiting and onboarding replacements, which we all know can be substantial, but also the hidden loss of productivity, morale, as well as culture. So oftentimes these peak performers or top performers, individuals are also culture creators. And we really see when people leave organizations like this, that culture can have a big impact as well. And so turnover isn't just a people problem, it's certainly a business liability issue that touches every part of the organization. And so let's dig into that liability and what it actually looks like in hard numbers next. But first, Anya, from your perspective, how have you seen this challenge show up in our client work that we do? I know you have a great story about a private equity client. Would you share that please for us today?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it just speaks to a practical example of what you were talking about before. We have a private equity client who is tripling down on retention. And one of the reasons why they were sort of started to prioritize it so much higher than anything else in the organization is because they felt the impact of a loss very deeply firsthand. And what ended up happening was an individual had left the company, and the partners did not realize how much of a culture carrier that individual was. And so what ended up happening was there were three other departures in quick succession after that particular individual left. And the reason for those departures, which was kind of elucidated during exit interviews, was the fact that this person was actually very invested in creating an inclusive community within the organization. They were informally mentoring many kind of associate employees across the business, and that was incredibly important to those individuals. And when that person originally departed, it really had reverberating, rippling effects across the entire company. And so oftentimes we don't have visibility into those kind of informal networks and relationships that exist within our organization. And one thing that this particular private equity fund is now prioritizing is understanding who is carrying those relationships, how those relationships sort of align and collate with each other across the organization to really gain a better understanding of these are the people that we need to continue investing in. We need to retain, we need to keep happy because they're actually the ones who are, doubling the impact across the business with others.
Wow. So you can really see in that story the ripple effect of losing these key people and not being able to get ahead of that. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide with some hard stats, because of course, this is very well documented and it's crystal clear when we look at these numbers. Losing an employee can cost anywhere from 50 to 200% of their annual salary. And so that works out to 10 to 25K for entry level roles, 36 to 60K for mid level, and over 100K sometimes up to 250K. So of course, these are not, hard figures. It's going to adjust based on that salary. But again, this is a hard cost for organizations. And like Anya just mentioned in that previous story of one of our clients, is that this can also have a ripple effect. So if one of those key contributors leaves and people are really connected to that manager or that leader in the organization, oftentimes it may change the outcome of their career path within the organization, which is certainly not something that we want, okay? And so there's beyond the dollars, of course, like we've just said, there's a lot of impact to organizations. And here's the frustrating part. Most organizations do know these costs. Yet, of course, they're still challenged with losing these individuals and not getting ahead of it. And so, Anya, from your experience working with senior leaders, what do you think gets in the way of organizations acting on what they already know?
Sorry, again, muted. It's a great question. And I think that it's different for different types of businesses. But I suspect a lot of the time, companies don't have a deep understanding of a couple of things. The first is there's no real kind of indicator or very reliable data in an organization that will give the signal that somebody is looking around or they're unhappy or they're looking to make a switch. People are habitual creatures, so their tendency, if they're happy where they are, is to stay in that place. It's not something that happens out of the blue. There are signals that lead up to the decision to make a change. But if organizations are missing those signals, then they're not able to proactively intervene or proactively act when there's still time. And the second kind of piece of information is oftentimes we don't actually know what drives someone, what motivates them. A company or a leader might suspect that one of their top performers isn't very happy and they might be looking around, but their reaction to it might actually miss the mark. They might think, oh, it's about salary and it's actually about like workplace flexibility. Or they might think, oh, they just want a bump in title, but it's actually about the fact that this individual feels like they never get recognized for their accomplishments. So what resonates with people is different. I kind of refer to it as it's almost like professional love languages, right? What works for one person is not going to be the same thing that works for another. And so there's that disconnect as well. And I think even though the understanding and the intent might be there, those two missing pieces can really lead to a bit of arrested development.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that oftentimes the application to these are generalized and not specific enough for that individual. And it's hard to know exactly how to approach individuals in terms of what is really important to them. If you're a big organization and you have lots of people, knowing exactly what to do when sounds like it's where they kind of have that gap or that missing piece here. Shelley, you had a question in the chat. So thank you for asking that. Are these USD or Canadian stats or costs? In the resource, we have both. We have Canadian turnover costs and USD. The specific stats there are from SHRM, so SHRM, which is a white paper that they released, and we can link that in the chat there. But again, there is specific costs for that we have in the resource that we're going to send today that have both Canadian and USD. All right. So uh, really, again, like we've just said, the gap shows up as we've explained, where organizations have a lot of data, but the actions that they take from that data can be missed, not accurate, not targeted enough for that individual, or too general. And so the signals are there. But they either come too late or they're not available ahead of time in order to make a difference, or they're not able to translate those signals or that data into tangible actions for strategy for leadership as well as actions for HR and managers. And so sometimes those signals are surfaced in exit interviews or annual reviews. So it's it's reactive as opposed to proactive information. And top talent has already disengaged or they've started to look elsewhere, things like that. And like Anya mentioned, then if they do discover that this individual, isn't happy, the application may not be accurate for that individual. And so other times, the early signals of burnout or lack of recognition or limited growth are getting brushed aside. And so even when the data is collected, which lots of our organizations are doing, there's oftentimes no accurate playbook, which leaves managers guessing really on what to do and how turnover can be prevented, as well as what we're seeing as people are slipping through the cracks. And so let's talk about some areas of opportunity here. But first and foremost, let's look at kind of what's happening with the information that they're looking at. Why are organizations continually missing the mark here? A big part of that is that they're focusing again on the wrong signals. And so relying on engagement surveys that are backward looking instead of predictive, missing early signs like tenure risk or stalled growth. The second challenge is that even when they do collect data, it rarely gets translated into action. Managers don't get playbooks or guidance they need or coaching that they need in order to foster those relationships and have really key conversations at key times with individuals, how to develop talent. And finally, the core drivers of retention, like meaningful recognition, career growth, and everyday manager support, are often overlooked. Without these in place, people start to plan their exits, even in organizations that are otherwise investing in data and programs. And so, Anya, from your perspective, what's the most common blind spot you see leaders make here? In terms of misinterpreting the data, looking at old data, what would you say is the most common blind spot that you see?
I think it's a great question, and there's several, but one of the things that we're starting to um, pick up on is a lot of organizations rely on sort of aggregated, annually collected data, or sometimes data collected once every couple of years, which makes this sort of exercise quite difficult. If we're going out, with a traditional engagement survey, once every 12 months or once every 18 months. By the time, the 6 month mark rolls around, sentiment oftentimes has significantly changed or shifted. If I ask you, Caitlin, do you remember how you were feeling 6 months ago about your career or your work or whatever it is, you're probably going to be like, No. But also you're going to say that there's a lot that has changed, even from a day-to-day morale perspective, we experience large shifts, not just when it comes to the workplace, but when it comes to our lives as a whole. There's lots of things that impact that: politics, our personal lives, our romantic relationships, our kids. And so as a result, our needs in the workplace change. And if we're as an organization are relying on signals that were collected, many months ago, that often makes it difficult for us to be proactive in the way that we engage with employees. So that's one of the challenges that I find companies can sometimes struggle with.
So it sounds like they're making decisions on data that may not be relevant anymore. It does take time also to intake that data and define what you're going to do with it and come back to employees with implementation and all of that sorts of stuff too. So there is a lag there, which makes a lot of sense. And as you said, the world is changing very fast, but so are businesses. And so a business may go through certain stages and shifts throughout it, just even in a year term. And so, exactly like you've said, it can be hard to make really targeted decisions based off data that may not be as accurate at that time that you're making the decisions. And so, as we've said, pulling this all together and to summarize kind of what we've talked about so far, common challenges that we're seeing in HR and people teams is that we're flooded with data. There's a lot of data for sure, but it's often stale, it's fragmented, or too complex to translate into meaningful insights. And so that really makes it hard to communicate a clear story, which is what we want our data to do. We want to be able to say, hey, here's what we've heard, and here's the actions that we're taking, or here's the next steps. And so the result of this is instead of being proactive, HR tends to rely on historical information to guide actions that take months to roll out. And by the time those changes are felt, employees may have already disengaged, which creates a real disconnect between the employee experience and HR's approach. And oftentimes this does come up in the data. HR is doing one thing and there's like a miss between the employee's experience and what HR is doing. And we do see that. And so let's take a pause here to hear from the audience a little bit. We'd love to hear from you. Is this something that you're seeing in your organizations as well? Is there anything that you'd like to add specifically that you're experiencing in your organization? We've got Anya on the call here, so you can hear directly from our president. Is there challenges that you're experiencing in terms of this that you're seeing? We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to put it in the chat if you'd like. And it looks like, thank you, Apurva. It's got a great poll. So, Anya, can you see that poll there? Did it pop up for you
Yeah.
as well? Awesome. So, what we're asking is, what's the biggest challenge you're facing when it comes to culture and retention today? And we're just going to give everyone a couple minutes to give responses, but it looks like, again, burnout and disengagement or soft quitting, as we're saying, this quiet exit. We've got about 77% so far of our attendees that are saying that is the top challenge. The second that we're seeing is identifying high potential or at-risk employees before they quit. Absolutely. And it looks like those are two are competing for the top place there. But exactly. So how do you know who's high potential? And how do you know if they're at risk to leave, right? How do you know that specific information from a generalized engagement survey? Anya, do you have anything to add to the poll that's coming in here?
Yeah, I'm seeing too. I kind of scroll down a little bit and I'm seeing too the second top one now is manager inconsistency or lacking tools for inclusive retention conversations. And then the third being lack of real-time data visibility. I really think that the manager point is very well made. And I think it's something that we'll talk a little bit later on in our presentation. But the reality is that a lot of the time, the career growth track for most professions inherently lends itself to becoming a people leader, regardless of, whether you're an engineer or a designer or you are I don't know, in construction or whatever it is. Typically, the career progression track does kind of go in that direction. And but oftentimes, once individuals move up into that people leadership role, they're not actually coached or prepared on how to be successful people leaders. It sort of just happens and then they have to figure it out. And it is an incredibly difficult thing to do and a very, very challenging thing to do well, right? How do you have difficult conversations with your employees? How do you show up in a way that's supportive, but also motivating and also kind of leading with purpose, right? So these are all things that managers sort of have to learn on the fly, oftentimes relying on their HR teams to sort of support them and guide them through it. But ultimately, that leaves them sometimes unprepared to notice things like quiet quitting or to be able to engage in an effective way to re-energize the team. And so that component of it, that education and upskilling of our people leaders becomes incredibly important for successful execution of any retention strategy we might have.
Absolutely. And Crystal, thank you for your comment in the chat. It sounds like you've experienced this, as well as that you've shared that you recently had a learning and development training. 90% of your leaders weren't participating, they were present but not engaged. And so this touches on a point, Anya, that you were just making. Specific individuals, oftentimes high performers, will get a management position and all of a sudden be leading a team, which is a completely different skill set. And so oftentimes we're also applying a generalized training route for those individuals in our organization that's not targeted or specific for what they need as well, right? And it sounds like, we do trainings, we do all these great things, but specific individual people leaders may be falling through the cracks in terms of what they really need for training and development in terms of their skill sets as well. And so becoming more targeted with that, Anya, I think is what you were getting at with that point there.
Yeah, definitely. And figuring out also how to make it land with our people leaders, why this is important. I think that there's sometimes that disconnect exists as well. Um, that leadership is an incredibly difficult skill to develop, and to develop it takes time, energy, and effort. And really kind of, if you have a certification or a CPA, that sort of is something that people recognize as, yes, this makes sense. Same thing on the leadership side of things. And I think that communication of how we position that for our people leaders becomes hypercritical, because they need to understand that their skill level in this particular area is actually what's going to keep the company running in a way that we want it to run.
Absolutely. And make them and their team successful too, which is, I think, what all leaders want. Absolutely. All right. So let's talk about our action-driven retention framework. So we've talked a lot about what the challenges is. Let's start to really get into what we can do about this. And so what this is a systematic, approach that turns those missed signals into meaningful action ahead of time, which is what we all want. So unlike traditional reactive approaches, this framework is designed to be proactive and predictive. And so, as we've demonstrated, most programs today are still reactive. Exit interviews, counter offers only coming into play after someone has already decided to leave. By then, it's potentially too late. Meanwhile, as we've seen in our poll, burnout is a very real issue. And so we have some research from Achievers here that shows 43% of employees report feeling burnt out, and 37% say it directly impacts their performance. And so this is why firms need a proactive systems-based approach that can really catch these signals early before employees are disengaged. And so our action-driven framework is built to help leaders do three things: spot early signals, act quickly with targeted support, and measure results with clear ROI, because that's what you bring up to your leadership so that they can really get bought into the importance of looking at this proactively. And so the framework rests on three key pillars that transform your approach in retention. Let's look at those next. All right, so first and foremost, let's look at each of these pillars individually. The first is early warning systems. So this is about spotting the real predictors of turnover before it's too late. Things like low engagement scores, tenure risk, in that 1 to 2 year window or lack of growth and mobility opportunities. So really looking at individuals as opposed to kind of large trends and being able to go, okay, what's happening for this key employee here? The second pillar is intervention triggers. And so this is where managers get equipped with the right playbook at the right time. So that's the support of your people managers so that they know they can build those skills and really know what to do in those key moments as well as have those conversations. And so whether that is a coaching nudge, a recognition and rewards programs, or having timely career development conversations. And as Anya mentioned earlier, knowing what to do with what specific employee and what's really going to matter for that employee because it may be different for individuals. And the third is feedback loops. So here the focus is on measuring what works and refining continuously. And that could mean dashboards on cost savings for leadership, improvements in manager effectiveness, or lists in engagement among high potential employees. So Anya, as we've seen in our client work, many organizations have one or two of these elements in place. Maybe they're collecting signals, maybe they've invested in recognition programs, but they rarely have a complete system that ties all of these three together. Why is that so critical for organizations to bring all of these three pillars into one system instead of having them as disparate systems?
I think what's really impactful is when you're able to kind of see the full picture. And I think so. One of the things, and obviously, as you know, Caitlin, we've been doing at Diversio is playing around with these ideas in the new platform that we've just launched. And the way that the platform works is we collect data from employees on an almost daily, if not weekly basis, where we're looking at those indicators of burnout and risk. So we're asking questions like, did you feel motivated to this week? Did you feel like you accomplished something exciting? Are you feeling overwhelmed by the amount of priorities that you have? Those create effectively a pulse of the level of morale and well-being of every particular employee. We find as a third party, we're able to collect these with relative accuracy to the employee's general state. After we do that, we track effectively risk, right? We're able to track, okay, this employee is close to burnout, or this employee is actually a potential churn risk in the organization. And once a risk is flagged, what we do is we go to the manager of the employee and we say, you need to re-engage with this person. And based on the kind of the motivation profile of this individual, based on what we know about what drives this individual, this is how we recommend you do it. It could be, public recognition of a job well done, or it can be connecting the individual to a mentor in the organization. It could be, encouraging them to take a self-development course. There's different types of kind of quote unquote interventions, but mostly tailored to the individual as well as to the risk that we're flagging for that person. And then ultimately, as a result, we're able to see the morale of that individual typically dip back up to where we want it to see to like safe levels for, an engaged person who is not looking to leave the organization. And having that feedback system is what actually ultimately allows us to build out the ROI for leaders. It's what allows us to go to leadership and say, listen, replacing this person would have cost X amount of dollars, because that's a pretty standard calculation when it comes to at least the visible impact of having someone. And I'm not even talking about like the culture carriers and those pieces. And this is what you were able to save, and ultimately how you're able to increase your productivity. And then for HR, it becomes important as well, because they're able to see, okay, these are the managers that potentially need a little bit of extra help because there's a lot of risks on their team. Like we're seeing a lot of burnout or a lot of people looking to leave on their teams. And that's an indicator that, hey, there is an education component potentially missing here, an upskilling component. So bringing all of these things together, and of course, you don't need to do this with us. You could do it yourselves internally as well. But bringing all of these things together gives you a full holistic picture of what's actually happening in your organization. And it allows you to be proactive with retaining your top talent as opposed to reactive when it comes to things like exit interviews or trying to figure out, post-mortem sort of what happened after it is a little bit too late.
Totally. And I just completed my survey this morning and it comes in my Slack. And I will say, I think what may come up for people is, are we over surveying, et cetera, et cetera. From my experience, completing our Optimo survey is quite easy. In the morning, it comes through my Slack and it's kind of like you were asking me, hey, how are you? And it's just 3 questions. So it's instead of being like a very in-depth survey that does take a lot of time, you got to sit down and figure out when to do it. I literally just open it when I go through my Slack messages in the morning. And it's a nice connection point because the questions are very, I would say, caring, for lack of a better word. It's like as if I'm sitting with my manager and they're going, how was your experience at work this week? Did you feel like you were engaged or did you feel like you were tired? And I'm like, oh, that actually is on the seat of an employee. It does feel like a nice little connection point. And because it's only 3 questions, it's really easy to complete. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay. So again, here's how we think about using retention data in a more systemic way across 4 key areas. First and foremost, motivation. So you might start a simple pulse survey asking, how motivated are you today? Like I just said, I got that question today. I said, I'm really motivated today. I'm excited about this webinar. So over time, you can build toward more advanced tools like sentiment analysis on team communications, but that's a really great place to start. For inclusion, begin with a straightforward question. Is your opinion valued by your team? That's the question that we ask to understand inclusion. And so then as your data matures, you can, of course, compare engagement, promotion, and attrition rates across demographics. So you can see if there's specific demographic groups that have a different experience of inclusion in your organization, or as we say, are facing inclusion barriers that you want to address systemically. For training, it starts with tracking learning program completion and satisfaction. But the real value here comes from measuring whether skills are accurately being applied on the job. So we all know this about training. They can be very effective right away, but as time kind of lapses after that training, individuals can stop using those skills or stop applying them in the workplace. And so you want to be able to see whether those skills are being implemented and used, and give individuals that have attended a training a little reminder, maybe 6 months down the road, or a little survey as we do, of kind of like a skill brief where you're asking them, are you using this? Here's a fresh reminder. Do you remember this from the training? Things like that. And so access to opportunity is, of course, really important as well. And so the basics would be checking if development plans exist in your organization. But the next level is tracking who's getting those stretch assignments and high visibility projects in your organization, and whether that's being applied equally in the organization and specific people that may get them time and time again, things like that. So the point here is you can start with small, simple data sources, and then you can build towards more complex advanced analytics that will give you real-time actionable insights like we're talking about. So a question to the audience here. Why do you think so many retention initiatives still fail even when companies have all this data? And feel free to put it in the chat. I'm going to head to the next slide and just talk about that, but we'll keep our eyes on the chat, just keeping my eye on the time here. So we want to first and foremost overcome implementation challenges and failures. And first, that's that we have a reactive mindset. So leaders wait for exit interviews, wait for turnover spikes before acting. And then by then it's already too late. The impact of the business has happened, right? Second is one size fits all program. So we've talked about this a lot today. Generic recognition, training, or survey programs that aren't meeting the needs of different employee groups, so they fail to move the needle. Third is data without actions. And we really see this as a key component here. Companies that collect engagement scores but where managers aren't equipped with playbooks to turn that insight into daily practices, and where employees may not be sure of what the outcome of those surveys were, is really a potential to erode trust in the program. And I honestly think that that's what creates survey fatigue for people. They feel like I already submitted my engagement information. I haven't really seen any change. What's submitting more information to the organization really going to do? So we do see that oftentimes. What actually works instead is empowering managers with real-time nudges and coaching, tailoring recognition and growth to what matters most for the individual employees, and using dashboards that connect interventions directly to retention and cost saving for leadership so that they can see the program is working. So let's talk about this in action with a case study.
Caitlin, maybe before we do that, do you
Yeah,
mind if maybe let's go back to the previous slide to like not
sure.
split it. But I just noticed that there's a few questions that are really pertinent to like this part of the discussion. So maybe we can go through a couple of them right now if you're up for it.
Yeah, let's do that. Absolutely.
Um, Amazing. Okay, so the first question, I think that there's four that I just wanted to kind of cover before we move on to the case study. So the first question was, you mentioned that signals surface in exit interviews. Our exit interviews just say people left for, quote, better opportunities. How do we get real feedback when they're still here? Great question. I think that let's be honest, typically when someone is leaving an organization, the mentality tends to be even if they had a very terrible experience, they don't want to burn bridges, right? That's what everyone always tells you, don't burn a bridge. And so oftentimes what that means is that the individual won't necessarily be honest in their answer or their response when you ask them what actually caused you to leave, right? And at that point, once they've already made the decision to sort of quote unquote break up with their employer, there's no real incentive for them to be honest, right? They don't really um, whether or not any change results in after they have left, it won't impact them. So really, when they are motivated to be more honest or to try to share something or change something, is while they're still within the business, which is why we're so emphatic about trying to collect that data, trying to collect that feedback while they're still invested in actually improving their day-to-day experience within the organization, which is why exit interviews are so tricky. In our experience, there is a way to get folks to be honest or at least more honest in exit interviews, and that's sort of appealing to their sense of if you could make it better for others who are staying and relying on their kind of relationships to the individuals in the organization and sort of motivating them through that path. But really, it becomes quite difficult to sort of succeed in doing it post fact, as opposed to while you're still in the business. So then the next question was, hey, at our mid-sized tech organization, we track engagement quarterly, but our best developers keep bouncing to competitors anyway. What's the deal with that? What early warning signs or examples actually matter for keeping tech talent around? Tech talent is interesting because, of course, the elephant in the room is pay. And that is a big contributor. How much we're able to pay is a big contributor when it comes to especially incredibly in-demand positions. However, that being said, as a software company ourselves that has seen very, very little churn on our tech and engineering team. In fact, I don't think we've had anyone leave in the last several years. I know that what also matters a lot of the time for engineering teams specifically is the ability to, one, feel like they are designing something very interesting, something that they're actually, passionate about, that they're learning, that they're being challenged every day. And secondly, learning from someone who is much, much better. at least as like a profile or an archetype, we find that a lot of the time that tends to be more of that engineer kind of developer mindset and archetype. Now, if you remember what we said sort of earlier in the presentation, different individuals are motivated by different things. And so figuring out what is that personality profile of everyone in the organization. And certain departments will have a tendency to have people who are motivated by, patterns of things. Once we figure that out, we are able to more effectively engage with talent to retain them. The way that we approach it is we use kind of a modified version of the Hogan MBPI framework. I'll put it in the chat, or maybe Caitlin, you could take a look at that. I would highly recommend it. But ultimately, it's only when you understand what really motivates someone will you be able to try and create an environment that will retain those individuals. And again, ideally, we're collecting that data, but you are saying that you're collecting it quarterly, which is great, and it's a good step towards kind of that ongoing data collection. Okay, so the next question is, when employees are struggling with burnout, what is the likelihood they will respond to a survey and that managers will actively leverage the tool? What is the advantage of a manager understanding how their direct reports are doing through regular one-on-ones compared to using the platform? It's a great question. And you're right, it definitely depends on the level of burnout. Of course, if someone is so burnt out that they can't even, engage with a one question survey, that is in itself an indicator to us that there's something going on with that particular employee. So a consistent lack of response is also in effect a response. No data is actually data, which we find kind of a really interesting component of our kind of system and the way that we approach things. Generally speaking, when it comes to managers are also people. And sometimes we forget that in our expectations. And how many of us have had a standing meeting with a manager that continuously gets canceled or pushed, or they're, messaging us being like, hey, so sorry, like stuck in a meeting with leadership. Can we do this next week? And then this happens like week in and week out. I see Caitlin smiling because I've done this to her like probably several times in the last month, and I'm sorry. And there's the things come up. It's just inevitable in like the work environment. I think what's different here is if you're getting these questions sort of, a question a day, once in a while, systematically, then we're not just relying on the manager to have the one-on-ones, to show up, be mindful, be present, not be distracted every single time that they're connecting with their team. Instead, we're relying on a system to surface that information for us. And there's a very big difference. Does a manager think that they're just going into a random one-on-one that isn't necessarily going to be that impactful, or like, why am I even kind of doing this? I have, a laundry list of things that I need to be working on, versus we tell a manager, hey, Caitlin is feeling burnt out. You need to get in there and you need to engage. Typically, our managers care. So they will, if someone tells me Caitlin is feeling burnt out and she needs help, I'll drop everything. I'll like jump in there with her and I'll be like, okay, what are we doing? Like, let's figure it out together. And so I think that that's the difference, right? It's flagging for the manager an issue, a risk, a challenge that someone on their team is facing, versus just saying, okay, relying on the kind of the standard one-on-ones or conversations, which might get rushed, pushed, canceled, et cetera, et cetera. I'm really not painting myself in a great light here.
No, you are. And I'll just add on that. Like, I always envision managers, especially mid-managers, they're so critical. They're the shock system of the business. And so they're oftentimes taking the, pressure between leadership and employee and kind of figuring out how to do the emotional work of ensuring that employees are protected from that shock system, and the communication and building the relationships between the business and the employees. And so as an employee, I understand what Anya is carrying in our organization because we've developed a relationship. And so I also think that that's a piece of it because, like you've said, managers are people too. And if you have a system that helps that individual understand how to build the relationships with their employees and have kind of like you said, some go-tos when they're having those conversations, that absorbs some of that pressure from that individual manager. Because it's a pressure cooker oftentimes when you're in mid-management. You're really the shock system of the organization.
Yeah.
And managers that do that really well kind of protect the employees from a lot of the business changes and communicate it really well. But managers that don't do that really well, that shock system it reverberates down to the employees, and then people feel, they feel that tension. And so I think that that's a piece of that.
Totally. Yeah. Okay. Last question, then we'll get into the case study. A real-time manager, the real-time manager nudges sound good, but what does that look like day to day? My managers are already swamped and honestly most uncomfortable with the whole coaching thing. Um, Fair enough. I think one of the things that so the system that we developed, we thought about this for a long time. We definitely didn't want to like add another dashboard to the long, list of dashboards and the sort of softwares that everyone has to use day to day. So the way that we created it is super simple. So we either plug into Teams or Slack, and the insights are delivered via, just direct message to a manager, or email, right? The whatever the preference is, like maybe like weekly, hey, these are the potential like risks that are flagged. This is what we recommend doing. And it's interesting that you say that your managers uncomfortable are not necessarily comfortable with coaching. In our experience, a lot of if you just say, hey, go recognize Caitlin, that might be more challenging for someone to do than if you kind of get them started. If you say, hey, this is how you could recognize Caitlin, or this is how you could potentially write a celebratory message, or if you're doing a well-being one-on-one check-in, these are the questions that you should ask. So it's almost like prompts, or almost in a way sort of thought starters to get a manager's wheels turning. And we find that that is uh, really helpful in a way to actually facilitate that action. So we're not replacing what the human aspect of what the manager does and what a people leader really kind of is for their employees, but trying rather to guide them if they need it. And we do find that that kind of lands. And the other thing is, if you do it in a specific moment with a specific employee, it becomes more practical and impactful than if you are doing just a general training, at the start of the year. So what I mean by that, for example, is you could have a training session for managers where you say, okay, this is how you give employees recognition, and they'll sit through it. And this is how you recognize someone who maybe needs a little bit of, extra love or a little bit of positive reinforcement. And they'll sit through it and they'll be like, okay, I get it. I know how to celebrate someone. But then when the time actually comes, they might not connect what they learned to the particular moment that is in front of them, like 6 months later. But alternatively, if you say, hey, this person would benefit from some recognition, these are some of the ways that you could do it, then they're like, oh, okay, this is my time to shine. This is how I'm going to, tell Caitlin that she's doing a wonderful job on this or this thing. And so it kind of makes the connection point a little bit more obvious and a little bit more meaningful.
I
Okay.
love that. And I think what you're saying there too is oftentimes maybe the perception is coaching is going to be telling them what they're not doing well or right, where it's the flip side of that. It's here's how to do this well, which typically people do like. And I think if it's good coaching, it's not even noticed as coaching.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Wait, sorry,
Oh,
Caitlin. One
yeah.
last question, and then we'll do it. I
Yeah.
totally skipped this one by accident. Okay, so how can HR teams differentiate between disengagement and employees just going through temporary low periods? Very, very good question. I think we all go through low periods, right? We all have periods of time, and they could have nothing to do with work. Um, and I think a lot of the time, what we typically recommend is if we're collecting data consistently, if we're having those kind of pings consistently about how an employee is feeling, we will see sort of that fluctuation occur. What really is a trigger is if we're seeing the employee's feedback saying, consistently over an extended period of time, over many weeks, I feel disconnected from my work. I feel like my manager doesn't really, give me anything interesting to work on. I'm not proud of the things that I'm accomplishing or that I'm doing. And if we're seeing that pattern emerge over a longer period of time, then that becomes, something that we really, really, really want to engage with. And either way, even if it has nothing really to do with the workplace, even if someone is just, going through a bit of a mental health situation or whatever it is, that's something the employer should really know about, in the sense of how can I show up and support you better during this time. Caitlin, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And when I did my mental health coaching certification, I was surprised to see if someone consistently has signs of depression. 2 week period is when you go, okay, then you may have depression within the intake. And so, really, if we're continuously collecting this information, and if someone over a period of time has had consistent low morale, whether that's life or not, it gives that opportunity for the relationship development of that manager to check in and say, hey, I've noticed you're going through a tough time. Do you want to talk about it? And that's where that the human centric element of business comes forward. And that's that relationship development that I think people stay around for, right? All right, so we've got a case study and we've got 6 minutes for it. So we will get through this. Just really kind of overview here. We were working with a mid-sized tech company. They were seeing rising turnover among their high potential employees. The engagement surveys are flagging low morale, but leaders could not pinpoint which managers and which teams or which skill gaps were the real issue here for the organization. So they had recognition programs and training in place, but those efforts weren't personalized or delivered at the moments when employees actually needed them, as Anya just said. We can't oftentimes forget the training if it's 6 months ahead. And so here's how we helped. We turned the signals into actions with Optimo. We looked at early warning signs and flagged at-risk employees showing low growth, declining manager effectiveness, and tenure risks. And from there, we were able to highlight critical soft skill gaps like communication, where managers needed specific coaching on specific areas like feedback, recognition, things like that, as well as inclusive behaviors to model. And I think that's really where we head. It's like, this is how we want you to show up. Here's a great example of that. Then we delivered real-time nudges to their managers, guiding them on when to check in, what to ask, how to tailor recognition for specific individuals in the way that mattered to that individual. And finally, we surfaced insights on the type of recognition that mattered to each individual employee, making sure it was meaningful as well timed. When they implemented this systematic approach, we really saw incredible results. They saw regrettable turnover drop by about 20% in the first year, which for that organization translated to roughly $225,000 in savings for a 20-person team, which is substantial for small organizations. Managers were able to build stronger skills in listening, coaching, and feedback, which they enjoyed, which because they saw the impact to their team, right? And they were able to kind of come away and go, wow, I really see how this impacts the team and our effectiveness together. And so effectiveness ratings improved by 15%. High potential employees reported a 10% lift in engagement. And most importantly, they told us that the recognition they were receiving actually felt meaningful for them, which I think is what we're really trying to get across here today. Culturally, employees reported greater trust and psychological safety, which created a stronger foundation for longer term retention. And from a leadership perspective, the finance team was able to track a 3.5 times ROI on retention efforts through avoided attrition costs, which is fantastic. So the entire organization saw the benefit of this program. So, Anya, when we look at results like this, what do you think is most powerful to leadership? Is it the hard ROI numbers? Is it the cultural impact? What do you think leadership cares about the most here?
Honestly, I think it depends on the leader. But of course, I think, listen, at the end of the day, all leaders want their businesses to be productive, um, efficient, and to succeed in doing the thing that the business actually does. But I also think that all leaders want their employees to be satisfied and enjoy what they're doing and be engaged and happy. And for them, and whether or not they want it just because out of the goodness of their hearts, or they want it because they know that people are most productive when they're happy and they're satisfied, really, ethically, maybe, it matters to us, but from a kind of a business perspective, I think for me at least, if we motivate leaders to be driven by the well-being of their employees, I think that we did a good job. And so I think that this sort of system really reinforces that. It frankly keeps the company healthy, and it keeps the employees healthy. So win-win.
Win.
That's kind of my last 2 cents, and I know that we have 2 minutes left. So Caitlin, maybe closing remarks to you.
I was thinking that groups work best. I do a lot of studying on like group and organizational psychology, and we all do best when it's a win-win, as you just said there. I love that you ended on that, and I think that's what we're all looking for. Everyone can have a win-win here when we are together working in a group and have a shared vision and outcome, and this really supports the organization and understanding how to do that well. And so that's my closing remarks. I know we've got through the questions. We do have a question here at the end, but again, we've got 1 minute left, so feel free to put it in the chat. Reach out to Anya and myself. Our LinkedIn's are there. We're always happy to answer questions. Thank you for spending an hour with us today to chat about this very important and critical topic, and we really do appreciate your time.